Good afternoon. My name is Thomas Caldwell and I'm the programmer at the Melbourne International Film Festival. Today's event is being held on the traditional lands of the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation people, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and the elders from other communities who may be here today. Welcome to Debra Granik In Conversation, a MIFF Talks event presented in partnership with the Australian Directors Guild. This year, the MIFF Talks program is presented by The Age. Debra Granik is an American filmmaker whose first feature film was Down to the Bone, which she directed and co-wrote. It world premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, where Debra won the Directing Award and the film star Vera Farmiga won a special jury prize. Debra went on to direct and co-write Winter's Bone, which was nominated for 4 Academy Awards. Best Picture, Best Actress for Jennifer Lawrence, Best Supporting Actor for John Hawkes, and Best Adapted Screenplay. In 2010, Debra completed her documentary feature Stray Dog, and her new film as director and co-writer Leave No Trace premiered at Sundance, screened in the Cannes Directors Fortnight, and is screening this year at MIFF. Moderating at today's event is Miranda Nation, an Australian filmmaker whose first short film, Eli the Invincible, won the SBS Programming Award at Flickerfest and was selected for MIFF, where Miranda participated in the Accelerator Lab for Emerging Australian Directors. Her short film Perception won the Dendy Award for Best Short Film at the Sydney Film Festival, was nominated for an ATCA Award and had its international premiere at Clermont-Ferrand. In 2015, Miranda received a Director's Acclaim grant from Screen Australia to work as Director's Attachment on Kate Shortland's feature film Berlin Syndrome. Supported by the MIFF Premiere Fund, Miranda's debut feature film Undertow will world premiere this year at MIFF this Thursday night. I would now like to hand you over to Debra and Miranda.
Thanks, Thomas. Hi everyone, welcome. It's lovely to see some familiar faces in the audience. This is an ADG event. I'm wondering how many people in the audience are fellow filmmakers. Show of hands, yeah, quite a lot. Okay, good, we can talk craft. Firstly, congratulations on all your work. I saw Leave No Trace very recently and absolutely loved it. It's an exquisite piece of filmmaking. Congratulations. I'm thrilled to be here, meeting you and talking to you.
I'm happy to be here.
Great. To begin with, I've been discussing Leave No Trace with a lot of people, and there's so many themes that come through. People relate to it on so many different levels. There's the theme of technology and its sort of ubiquitous nature now in our society. There's the political relevance of children being forcibly removed from parents at the moment. What spoke to me, at a very deep, heartfelt level, was the father-daughter relationship and that archetypal story of a child growing to the point where they want to spread their wings and leave the nest. In this case, quite an unusual situation. So I'd love to hear what was it about the story that most drew you to the subject matter and the material?
Well, the film is based on a novel from the Pacific Northwest, which is the uppermost corner right before Canada, on the Pacific coast of North America, and it's a temperate rainforest. And the novelist is from that region, and the whole package interested me because the setting was extremely rich. Upon reading his novel called My Abandonment, I could tell that it would be very textured to photograph. Though it's hard to photograph nature in a narrative feature without going Natgeo on things, I still knew that if people were living and trying to actually perform tasks in the forest, that it would not. There could be opportunities to appreciate visually through lenses nature, but that it would be also, there would be some drama in that, and especially because of the perspective of this forest. The trees are they're tall, and we were filming in a place where there was some old growth left, some of those very massive trees. And in his story, which he based on an article that had appeared in the paper in his hometown of Portland, there was already mystery. Why are this father and daughter living undetected in a public park, just touching, abutting the city of Portland? What are they doing there? How have they been undetected? How is that even possible? What do they need from this situation? What do they not want to be a part of? And should they be captured, or when they were captured, what would become of them? And so this novel was operating on a lot of different levels. It was the here and now of just seeing people in a rich environment. It was immediately cracking open some massive themes about why do we choose the lifestyles we do, and what would happen if you wanted to get out of one and try another, and do people without property even have a choice about what lifestyle they ever will pursue? Without property, how do you actually ever go against the grain, unless you become sort of a pariah status? There's a difference between being self-extricating versus being someone who's unhoused and on the streets. And then, of course, as you mentioned, inside that, there are these two characters who are living in a very intense dyad relationship, which would be, parent and child, but in this case, a parent and child who complement each other in very specific ways, but who also have some very, like all family members, salient differences that will require different needs going forward. So that's already a tension. Leaving the nest is something every sapien has to do. But how we do it, we never tire of reading how that goes, right? Because cleaving yourself from someone that you love or that has influenced you or that you've been dependent on, any of the above or all of the above, is one of the things that, to be human, must happen at times, and yet it sort of never gets easy, really, unless it's an outright emancipation and liberation where you're just so done with whoever's held you back or who's not been good to be around. And then we're talking about a different thing. But in this case, our characters aren't in that situation. They're still very inextricably linked to each other, and their functioning really is very co-determined. They really are a team. It's almost like, who can ask for more? You open a book and it's got these things, and your mind is already being jogged in all these directions. That to me is a checklist of things that it could be, or tell me, wow, this is pretty. This could pop on screen. This could be something, and it was filmable. It's doable. There's nothing highfalutin about it. A lot of the things that were going to be filmed are very low key in terms of photography or how one approaches that from a narrative filmmaking perspective. So that whole bundle is how I got involved.
And so can you speak a little bit about the adaptation process? Because I know there are some quite large differences between what happens in the novel. Some would even argue some more dramatic events that happen in the novel that have been left out of the film. Yeah. Did you also go back and research the real story that was based on? Did both influence the film, etc.?
Yeah, well, so in this story, there was no really additional research. The author had done what he did, which was based on two brief articles. The the Tom character was a minor, and so social services, out of a very important need, closed those cases. That that child is no longer available for like public scrutiny, and it's not okay just to start to like pry open someone's life and keep exposing them, especially in this case. It felt exceptionally tender, to try to make public and expose people who have so deliberately tried to be undetected. I mean, that's to me almost like in itself an essential tension of this. And it was brought out in his book much more, right? In the film, there's a tiny reference where the man that gives them the housing that sort of signs on to see if he can kind of provide housing and an internship for the father, the tree farmer, makes this very passing remark, and the social worker sort of shuts him down. He says, "When I read about you in the paper."
That's right. Everyone wants to live like a lot of people.
And we had cut a scene where he shows her he goes, "Have you ever seen the article on you guys?" And he passes it to Tom, and she's reading it. And I like the scene very much because she's just like, why did they want to write about us, And then he actually expands on that a little bit, just the idea that people maybe actually were projecting a lot onto them, And but the fact remains that was in direct, I would say, direct opposition to what he was striving for, right? In terms of being a gray man, and so the adaptation deviated hugely towards the second half. So the Novelist and my screenplay, or our screenplay, is following the basic setup of the article. Encampment in a public park. Rangers detected them after many years of living there. It was a chance. It was sort of a fluke that caused them to be detected. And they were placed on a farm, and that's all that was known.
And there was a second article that they actually had
fled the farm.
Fled again,
right,
and
right.
Was anything ever known about them after that?
Correct, right. So, I think ultimately...
They were found again. And
detectives could have, I'm sure, tracked down the father, and I think, again, they were trying to protect her identity a bit, so she folded in somewhere, and I think her father was becoming increasingly psychiatrically unstable. So in the real story, we downplay that a little bit because it was important for the father to be reliable enough that he was relatable on some level. He's already doing something so against the grain that for us to not be able to relate to him at all, the story sort of forecloses really early.
You just
then
want
all
her
we
to get away.
Right, exactly, exactly. So
I think that's what was so cleverly done is that, I wanted their idyllic lifestyle to be preserved, and yet I could see how she was yearning to be part of this world that she was discovering, and that conflict between, these two people who love each other and want to be together, but what they want is so different. And as an audience member, I think, you're just held in that tension for the whole piece. It's beautiful.
Well, I'm glad that worked because that was a hard part of the film to solve.
Okay,
and but then so the deviation even further goes that. So Peter Rock, in a conversation with him, with the author, I was able to kind of confess to him that I couldn't relate to one part of the second half of the novel in which the father was murdered in a way that was, or it was a grisly death. I mean, it was a murder, that they found some people that are nefarious in the woods actually sort of slightly entrap him, and it comes to a very bad end. And I said to him really honestly, I said, that's just the part of the novel that I don't even know where that comes from. And he's like, oh, well, there's a reason for that, that character, the nefarious characters come from my previous work. So I latched onto this reality that some regional novelists actually work that way, and maybe mystery writers. I mean, I don't know anything about being an author, but the fact is, I have a hunch that, in the work of screenplay writing and films, it's very frequent that someone that you've conjured for a previous film ends up in your next film, right? That happens all the time, and so I'm thinking it is parallel with or commensurate with novels. And he basically said to me, point blank, absolutely, these characters come from something else, and that's why my brain works with them. They're in my imagination, but it makes sense that they didn't materialize in an understandable way in your imagination. And he's like, what did you think happened? What do you imagine happened after they left that farm? And I told him my thoughts, and he's like, you should go for that. You should at least try a draft. You owe it to your imagination, or you owe it to the process to at least try a draft. Now, draft can never see the light of day. It can be torn up in 12 seconds, push, delete, whatever it takes. That draft never has to go on, but try it. And that was really wonderful. It was a good moment in the history of this project, because I did feel very emboldened and happy to do that. And then my next stage is very different than his, which is that I then take my screenplay and try to go and do reconnaissance at the real location. So the screenplay is undeniably set in the outskirts of Portland, in the outskirts, and it was important for me and my producing partner to go there. And then, especially because I'm outsider, I come from the complete opposite coast, so you guys know about huge coastal differences in your country, and so I needed to be very much, I had to put my kind of anthropology mode on, right, visual anthropologist, which is take really good notes, ask why, pick up on dialect, pick up on customs, pick up on how people do things here, what really seems to matter, big ardor for the Pacific rainforest, I mean, honestly, if there could be Shintoism in modern day America, it would occur there, worship of trees, it would be there. Pick up on just little details that need to be in there. Should she go down the lane when she's placed at this farm? Who would she find? What are rural kids doing? Hence discovering the 4-H, the agricultural club for youth, asking a truck driver, should a girl cross the tarmac, or the parking lot at a truck stop, how would you decide what you're going to do and how you're going to react, and there have been a lot of publicity about trafficking and, what to look for in the parking lot, and the idea of a minor girl just sets off bells, and who's this man? And so he tried to work with me on that front. So then the screenplay is getting hugely inflected and influenced by who I'm meeting, what they really care about, what they're really saying. In fact, the beekeeper had been called out in my script because I had been interested in that for a minute, but then meeting the real beekeeper, she's telling me, I don't know about beekeeping. She's telling me, how she would begin to explore this with a kid that was interested, and then based on that teen's receptiveness, she would then maybe divine whether the kid could actually maybe go on to handle bees and whatnot, and so that became a very rich trajectory in the screenplay that I could actually act on, because I had at my in my collaboration now was this really experienced beekeeper who could play herself on screen, and Tom took a real shine to her, and and then I think it was no small contribution to collaborate with someone from another hemisphere, Thomas and Mackenzie from Kiwi, born and bred, passionate about the bush, and reverential relationship to nature that the New Zealanders, many seem to have. All two of them, no. but the fact is, she came so ripe for this project. But the fact that she was outsider also helped.
Also really worked.
She could stand there with a lot of integrity and honesty, and just be observing. And Tom, the character of Tom, obviously that was so at her core. She's not a Pandora. She didn't come down in yesterday's rain. I mean, she's seen the VA. She's seen things. She's very, maybe an uncannily observant teen, right? She's had to be.
Yes.
She travels, she runs with a person who's hypervigilant. She's got to check on him a lot. She's got to be really a good calibrator of mood and disturbance. Plus, she's had to live undetected, so she's very keyed into noise, sound, when someone might be approaching. What kind of sound is it? When is it a safe sound? When is it a familiar sound? What are the patterns? When do the work crews come? When does the ranger come through? The pack of dogs. She kind of senses if there's even one more. She's just been a very keen...
Well, all that detail is so rich there, the way they live in the camp. How did you create that detail? How did the actors prepare for their roles?
So they did get the opportunity. It was very fortuitous that we could work with a skills trainer, someone who she herself had been incredibly accomplished. She had lived 45 days in that same kind of rainforest, even a more austere part of it. 45 days with 2 tools. Wow. And she was a champion, and she's kind of has, rock star status in the primitive skills world, which is a big world, actually. And also very wonderfully and excitingly for me, a world where women do really well. And, I got so much pleasure from just researching what skills they would be doing from YouTube, and just seeing this absolutely wonderful woman in some, I don't know which woods in Germany she was, but she was doing it in the snow, building her shelter. People get so advanced in this art, and it starts to blow your mind when you hear someone who's really passionate in that subculture, because what they're really saying is that 10,000 years ago, all of what we are, we would have known how to do all these things. As arduous and intense as they are, we would have known how to do them. I mean, we did them, right? Yeah. And then very few of us have any of that knowledge left, and primitive skills people are really committed to seeing if they can share some of that, And Tom and Ben, the actors, just really took a shine to it, to the point where they were really practicing on their own, and they were rehearsing, and Tom became really adept at that knife. So what you see on screen is really her feathering that wood to make tinder. She's peeling back pieces that curl to make a very amplified, robust fire starter. And
did they go and live in the woods, in the bush?
They didn't sleep there,
themselves?
but they had quite a few days in the camp to rehearse, and they got a chance to cook for each other and eat the food they cooked and get familiar with the camp. And then with Nicole, they did go off for a couple days. Okay. And they didn't do, they didn't do any kind of,
alone with two tools.
Yeah, it wasn't, like one of these, outward bound moments or something. They came in at night, But the fact is, during the day, they were looking for things that they could forage. She was talking about mushrooms, things that were edible, herbs, whatnot, and so making the shelter, building a fire, using that knife properly. Those were all things that she was able to kind of make a mini course for them, but it helped them so much feel that they could do these things, that they could. So that allowed for good traction and good rapport between them in the camp. So Tom could really say, "Pass me something," and she could really mean it because she's really knowing what she's doing. He's lighting the fire. He needs another stick, and she needs to keep making them. Every take she's got to keep making them. He needs them. Every time we burn one, she's got to provide another one. So. And he's really using his lungs, right, to really blow on that tinder. And those are all things that you start to feel. You see the texture, you feel it. The sound is recorded. When someone's really using their lungs, you can feel that later on the screen because you're hearing it. And so those things really enriched what was going to happen and the idea of like actual expenditure of energy, torque, focus. Yeah,
fantastic. And going back to that idea of sort of the conflict in the story, I mean, I think in screenwriting we're often told there's no story without conflict. Actually, in Leave No Trace, a lot of the places where perhaps in a more, traditional cliche film, they might have come up against these points of conflict, people are helping them. Generally people are kind to them, the social services, the guy that brings them to live on their farm. In those places, they're not experiencing conflict as such. There's a much greater inherent conflict in the story. As a screenwriter, were you sort of aware of subverting expectations like that, or it just felt more authentic to you to tell it like that?
Yeah, well, of course, that is a huge underlying something that we monitor, right, as makers of fiction, and in documentary as well. How's our pulse with our suspense and our tension and conflict, like you say? And I mean, what was tricky, as much as I said, oh, wow, enticing bundle that comes with this novel, then I on a different day, if you asked me, or when I was writing the screenplay, I would say, oh my God, trying to talk about the tension and existential tension of what it means to not conform. Social conformity is a tension. How do you depict that particular? It's not exactly a villain, but it's a tension. Social conformity is omnipotent, right? It wants us all. And it's not that it's a conspiracy or there's any evil force. That is also what it means to be sapient, right? It's like that
desire to belong.
That first of all, we almost don't know any other way to behave other than to expect, mostly, especially in a welfare state, that people want much of what we have, right? That what we have is what everyone wants. That the kind of dwelling we have, oh gosh, I think everyone would want one of those, we also acknowledge, luckily, on the good side of the welfare state, right, that we acknowledge that three basic needs that have been with humanity the entire time are still hugely in play, right? So that those things, just heady off of hearing Pope Francis just call them the three T's, But that's an Italian, of course,
Right, yes.
But they're the same. They're the same three things. And so in the tension in this story is, how do you get those things, right? If you're going to go against the grain, first of all, the tension of going against the grain, somebody wants you back. A social service agency, other people, your relatives, going against the grain, hard to do. To be a non-conforming person is already tense. Really, nobody wants you to be that way unless you can abscond, unless you can leave, unless you can be unseen. The tension of growing differences that will end in a fork in the path, that's a tension. The father feeling that he knows that he can't control her or suppress her, and nor does he want to. But that he felt that it was sort of, I think he felt very convicted that if he could, she has the rest of her life to conform. That was a line he used to say. He used to just outright say that. And he was just trying to provide this one chapter for her where they could think their own thoughts, And that tension goes way back to philosophers from all countries. I don't know the ones, I'm not familiar with the ones in Australia, that come the 1870s wondered, what it would be like to do with less and to try not to participate in, the Industrial Revolution and do with less. And, we had a philosopher that right at that epicenter of the Victorian times, he was asking those questions, a philosopher called Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, and there was a movement called the Transcendentalists, and they were all about what could they do? How little do you need to be happy? As they saw the way that money would start to really dictate every decision people would make, and as capitalism would advance, and they asked the unthinkable: what happens if you don't want more? And
that's another large theme to be taken from it is the schism between this society that's completely focused on exponential growth, and a planet that actually can't support that growth.
Right. So we're thinking those things. We're as viewers, we're providing those tensions, right? Yeah. Same thing with a cell phone. Within 3 years, 5 years, it became aberrant to decline a cell phone. It became, it's considered, a weird thing to do.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
He says we've always been able to communicate before without a phone. Why do we need one now?
Exactly. So that's a little micro tension. So the film has these smaller tensions.
Absolutely. It's full of tension. Yeah. I guess some of the choices, though, another screenwriter might have made the social worker more of a villain, an antagonist. That, she was, because she wanted them to conform, evidently, but she wasn't. She was very compassionate and caring and tried to find the best for them. So those type of choices to make, where there could have been an obvious antagonist, to choose another route, I found very interesting.
Right. Well, the irony there is, of course, first couple drafts, she was written a little harsher, right? She was more the man, right? Towing the line, and some of the things she asked were just a little bit more, judgmental and whatnot. And then, of course, through some beautiful correspondence with a social worker from there, she emailed me. I emailed her some questions. She took a lot of time to answer the questions, and then we met with real social workers when we were out there. And then so the real research for me was that I would have been throwing them under the bus, really. It's like, oh, really? How do you live with yourself after you talk to 4 social workers, all of whom had very soulful things to talk about, dilemmas, and how much of their lifestyle could be preserved, the option not to put them in a family shelter system, and so I'm like, wow. And then I would gain the trust of people, and then all of a sudden forsake them and write shitty social workers, and realizing how hard that work is anyhow. And if you think about it, most people, who signs up to be a social worker? People that are malevolent, who want to do people in? No, people that want to perform as much as possible, even though it's within the confines of a bureaucracy that can sometimes jaundice and botch things. The fact is, they want to perform a positive intervention usually. They want to be of service somehow. And,
yes, authentic portrayal was really important. That brings me on to another question. There's this beautiful use of humour. For example, the Rabbit or the Animal Appreciation Society, and then in the scene at the church, the dancers, I can't remember their name.
For His Glory dance troupe.
You present these people with a kind of this. There's something amusing about these situations and these people, but your touch is so tender and delicate. It doesn't feel in any way like you're making fun of them. How do you expect the audience? Do you expect that to be amusing, or?
So that's a complicated one. That's super complicated. Meaning that the evangelical devotional dance world, or devotional dance doesn't have to be evangelical, because in other states it's associated with older churches, and Baptist and Presbyterian. Well, no, mostly Baptist and urban churches. There's a big devotional dance movement, and this troupe was from Oregon, and I contacted them, and they said they were very willing to perform in the film, and I, really appreciated what they were doing, and my appreciation grew as I sort of understood that this was from the anthropological perspective, it's a big continent, big country, so 50 states, and in each of those states, devotional dance is being performed. And so I had to really take note of that. I was like, it's not my culture. I don't totally understand it. And I don't necessarily feel maybe connected even to the religious tenets that are underneath it, other than the idea that celebrating passion and faith can be a very thousands of years old human pursuit. And so I tried to go back again as an anthropologist and say, wow, Tammy and her dancers are in a long lineage of people who have, attempted to feel something and feel good and feel at one with something, feel moved by something. And their citation for their practice is that dance and celebration was very mentioned in the Judeo-Christian Bible, and that it's fallen out a bit, and so part of this current revival is to see if that can be a part of the practice again. To keep people coming to church, keep people interested. There's got to be a reason. You could just listen to a podcast of your pastor.
Sure.
So to come to the brick and mortar means there's got to be something there to do and feel and watch.
It was really interesting in the screen. Sorry.
Oh no, but the laughter does ensue, and so I have to.
Yeah, it was interesting in the screening. I saw that when they were introduced, there was laughter in the audience, but then once they started dancing, the laughter disappeared. It was like what you were saying, that once you saw what they were doing and the devotion and the dedication they had, it was hard to laugh.
And they're good
but
at
the idea
it.
of them was kind of funny.
Yeah, and also and even their costumes are homemade, and so even those can look kind of, odd. They're a little bit between places, of style and whatnot. But I think what really helped was that Tammy, the lead dancer, was very accomplished, and she runs like a business as well, where she sells the flags, which are a big part of this particular form of devotional dance. And so she's she's also a very worldly businesswoman, and but she's took such care to tell Tom about the flags. So once you hear her speak, then you realize, okay, this is a person who's doing this very deliberately. We're not just by accident observing people that we just, tee-hee because they look different than we are, and you realize, okay, this is her thing. She's self-reporting. Then again, you can decide to make fun of her, but it's on you. Then it's on you. It's on you because she kind of has the last word in the sense that she's talking casually and proudly and comfortably about her hobby, and so, I think there's just that craving that I have to have moments where some of the takedown culture between red and blue, between conservative and liberal people, can sometimes just be, if you bring two forces close, even though there's repulsion in those magnets, it's kind of interesting to try to get at that zone in between, where if there's eye contact and it's not just on the internet, there's some force of attraction right there. People can actually be attracted to some strand of the other if we bring ourselves in close proximity, I think.
So, I mean, a lot of your work, all of your work, tends to deal with communities that are in some way on the fringes, or people that are on the somehow marginalised. I know that you started making documentaries and you worked making educational films about workplace safety, etc. How has those sort of beginnings and that transition influenced, do you think, your aesthetic and your work?
I think working, as a documenter of workplace, for these educational health and safety videos in a time when we did have unions, when we had trade unions, I think one thing that struck me was that as a visual anthropologist, I love looking at what people do during their day. I like looking at how they perform their work, what gives them a respite at work, where's the camaraderie, what makes life worth living. How do you enrich your life when it's hard scrabble? I've always been interested in survival when it's not just distributed evenly, as we know it's not, right? The pathway and is not made clear. Not everyone's invited even onto a path, and so that early work allowed me to know that, and just that I'm in this long lineage of scopophilic people. I get pleasure from lenses. I get pleasure from seeing something in a way that's different than my human eye can show me. The intensity of some task that someone's performing, something in their eyes that is being reflected about the nature of their work or their workplace or their exhaustion or their something. So I feel that all that was in service to loving to be a collector, a chronicler, a note taker. And then the harder task is sometimes how to put that into narrative fiction. Because I could be someone easily, and my heart lies kind of in the semi-experimental world because I can linger a long time in someone's workplace. I don't really ever want to be, and yet sometimes the timing of your film dictates that, someone could scan 3 things at the checkout in the grocery store.
Yeah, I was just thinking of those scenes in Down to the Bone.
But I could be interested in someone scanning 50 things, just taking someone through that whole, not to alienate the audience, not to freak everyone out, but just this notion that, people's shift doesn't just end like that. You don't just scan 3 things on your, and
you're scanning all day.
And I love that from, I actually really value that from the neorealists and the social realists of European tradition, even like I would say, early Mike Leigh or the kitchen sink movement in Britain, the Italian neorealists everywhere, really frequently honor work, and just acknowledge that's a huge part of people's lives. At minimum, it's 40 hours, right? At minimum, and for a lot of people, it's double that. So. I like that that's often really central in neorealist or social realist work. I think that's sort of how my background did inform that part of my interest or my focus.
And can you talk about going into communities when you've already talked about going to Portland and, for example, the Ozarks in Winter's Bone, and how you work with communities, and you often cast some of the roles from the communities, from non-actors in the communities?
Yes, I do like to do that. And I think that's also the nervousness of the outsider, right? So, I can't go to the Ozarks or any, specific region, and then what am I going to do? Import some extras, that wouldn't be from there, So you've got to very much, if you're going to go, if it's going to be regional filmmaking, then you're definitely going to need to have huge infusion from the actual coordinates of where you're filming. And with the Ozarks, of course, it's very different. That's like trying to roll into, is it called Cunnamulla? Connemara. Thanks, Dave. There was an incredible documentary done years ago. It's at the end of a long railroad track, very forsaken place. Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
So.
Does anyone remember the name?
Yes. Think about, a heavily caffeinated Melbourne filmmaker rolling into that town, talking a mile a minute, using lots of gestures, talking about feelings and, and blah, blah, blah. And don't you think like an elder in that town would just be like, you're already guilty. You just talk too much. That's very much how it was like in the Ozarks, that I was considered a city slicker from the East Coast, and why are you coming out to Hill Country? You're just going to make another rancid hillbilly exploitation film? What do you want with us? And so in that case, it was really important to get a fixer, a guide right from there. Turns out he was just utterly bilingual. He was really of that place. 100% of that place. But for whatever reason, he was also slightly worldly, and he was really our translator, and he was our diplomat. He was the person who could say, "Hey, give these city slickers a minute. Let them sit down with you. Just sit down with them and see what the project is." And the book had been written by an author from that region, and the author had gone to great lengths to not, he was not going to do an exploitation film, and then it was my job even to maybe veer that away even more as an outsider. I mean, it was on me even more than this local author. And so what happened there was by showing in the screenplay that we weren't going to just focus on the meth problems in that community, but that the heroine should be like a folk hero. She was going to be someone who was trying to actually avoid that, right? She was looking at the loss front and center. My dad's been taken with it. You know, my uncle is caught up in it. This is real loss. My family's hemorrhaging to this, you know, really awful, insidious drug that, you know, is a drug of poverty. And so they, I think, could see that the project was not, you know, it wasn't out to create this negative portraiture. And then once he was able to get us to all talk, then a lot of great collaboration could ensue from that. And we got huge input. We were able to film on a family's property, and they ended up being very influential, playing themselves, you know, and I relied on them heavily. And I relied, one of the children from that piece of property ended up being the little sister.
Oh, right. Yeah.
It was called out for a boy. We tried to cast boys, but they were from the town, like some of the cities nearby, and their teeth were all fixed, and they had already been in plays, and you know, it was just they were scared of the property.
Yeah.
You know, the little girl who was running around telling us, you know, how to, you know, where things were and showing the crew things, and you know, she was like our little assistant, you know, pint-sized little helper. And finally, I just had to beg her mother. I just said, you know, could you broach this with Ashley? Could you see if she wants to play the little sister? And we tried to make it, you know, just a make-believe game. You know, this is your older sister. Really listen to her. You know, all you really have to do is just really listen to her. Follow her directions, meaning if she tells you to come in for dinner, come in for dinner, you know. And it worked out. But other members of the family were sometimes with me, you know, next to the monitor. Yeah. And I'd say, do you believe that? You know, was that right? And they would be just bold-faced, frank with me and just say, no, you know, no, that's not how, you know. And so it was so informing, and I was really very reliant on them, and they, you know, and I think, and they, you know, so, but there has to be an exchange. You know, what are they getting out of it? You know, so I know what I'm getting out of it, and what are they getting out of it? And I think in this case we were lucky that they were genuinely interested in the filmmaking process, and so that given that their family property was the entire set for the entire film, basically, you know, they had a lot of skin in the game. And of course, then there's also a way to very much do an economic input by a very substantial location fee to the family. And, you know, so there's ways to make some of it work quite well. I mean, but it's not without some problems. You know, there was an incident that was, you know, it seems ludicrous when I repeat it, but it was so real, it was so vivid at the time, where there was this serious misunderstanding where, you know, the protocol by a film crew, when you're going to ask to film all night in someone's house, you know, and keep them up late, is to offer them a room right down the road, offer them a hotel accommodation. And I think somehow the way it got translated was that was a requirement, that they couldn't be in their house while we were filming. And so we get this call saying, we have to withdraw. You know, you cannot film on our property. And this is, you know, I mean, we were already kind of deep in. Yeah. You know, you can't film on our property anymore, and you know, we don't want you here. Wow. And Richard, we had to call Richard, the fixer, and say, Richard, what happened? My God, what happened? Oh my God, please talk to them and see what happened. And so it turned out that they thought we were requiring that they vacate,
they go and stay in a hotel.
And they don't ever vacate their house. And they said, you know, the reason we don't vacate our house is that there are 248 shotguns in the basement, and we don't leave that house unlocked, you know. And I was like, gulp, you know. Kind of wish I hadn't known on some level, but the fact is, there we were. And so I'm like, oh, no problem. You do not have to leave your house. In fact, you're right. It would be a lot safer for you to be there. And let's just proceed. And so, you know, there was these times when I did feel so that I had walked, obviously I had, you know, into a different world, and I had to tread so carefully, and I felt like, you know, one of the big laws that you can't violate is you can't violate it, even if you wanted to. You can only be there by permission. You know, you can't roll in and decide, you know, what's going to come of that. Nothing will result. And in fact, you will be chased off, you know. So it can be, I mean, that's extreme in the sense that the cultural chasm there was really tremendous. Portland, obviously, very different set of circumstances. For that, it was much more about learning something about the woods, learning something about the outdoor skills, learning something about, on the logistical and craft level, learning how to shoot in the rain day in and day out, you know, and having a crew that was so experienced. If you live in a temperate rainforest and it rains 7/8 of the year, you know how to make a fully waterproof shoot, and we felt really high. You know, the people that weren't from there felt excited to feel not invincible but flexible. You know, able to do it, and they made it. They were really good teachers.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
And can you talk about how you cast your leads? What your process is there? Obviously, Jennifer Lawrence was a massive breakout role in Winter's Bone, and people are wondering whether Thomasin McKenzie is going to be the next Jennifer Lawrence.
She'll be, as she says, she'll be her own.
Yes, she'll be the next Thomasin McKenzie.
Yes, exactly.
How did you find her being a New Zealander?
So she was actively seeking work. Thomasin, you know, was looking for scripts and
she's
putting it out
worked quite
there.
A lot in New Zealand, hasn't she?
Right. She was on a very long running.
Shortland Street.
Exactly. I don't know if it's a after school series or a soap opera or something.
Shortland Street.
So she had been on that, and then she had done a very hard-hitting drama about sex abuse that was in the PD there, or like a high-ranking police official had participated in something, and so she had been in those, but I didn't know of any of that. I mean, only because those things don't necessarily translate, right? Like they don't. Certain homemade things don't travel. But you know, she got hold of the script and then responded to it and then submitted an audition. And I wasn't aware of it. And of course, because I'm clicking, you know, on a set of auditions that have been submitted, like videos, auditions. And I click on this one and I thought, well, that's super strong. But again, no context. It doesn't say, you know, of New Zealand on the bottom. It just says her name, right, and her age accent or something, you know. And right, she'd already, you know, done sort of a midway accent, you know. But the audition really stuck with me. I was like, oh, I watched many, many more, and I'm like, let's find out who that person is. And, you know, they find out, and then, of course, it's like, oh, she's not on either of the coasts where I could go meet her, you know. She's not even in the same hemisphere, so therefore that immediately, you know, put up a little bit of a problem. Like, there was no way to even meet her, but then Skype helped with that. And so then conversations ensued, and she was so forthcoming about her interest in the project and the level at which she had read the novel and the screenplay, and she was teeming with ideas, and you know, she's just in every way she could, putting it out there that her interest was sincere and that her level of commitment would be really high. And those were just signs you need to feel like, this would be such a rich collaborator. She so wants to do this. And then, you know, it was possible. And she was able to get a gap year from school. You know, her parents are very enmeshed in the acting community in New Zealand. And they were so very supportive, you know, the opposite of anyone's nightmare of stage parents or anything. They were just all about how do we make this work and how can we support the production. So it was really good.
And what about Ben Foster? Were you quite familiar with his work before you started casting?
I was, you know, he has a goodly amount of films to watch, and I was interested in the fact that he had portrayed veterans before and that he had taken it upon himself in previous work to look into the lives of combat veterans and to understand and embedded with military people, with people who'd served, so that he came already imbued with this. This was something that he brought to the character as well, which was going to be very helpful, given that the backstory wasn't going to be very explored. But Ben had some sense of how he might endeavor to step in the shoes of that character. And he was very game for the outdoor part of it as well, which is crucial.
Yes.
I mean, this was not a cushy shoot, you know. People had to get wet. People had to have the dirt and really move, really trek, really be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then your rehearsal period, do you have like to have a long rehearsal period? You know, how do you work in rehearsals?
I love to have a long rehearsal period, but you know,
do you get to have one?
who's going to fund that, right?
Yes.
You know, I mean, it's hard to pull off. But I did have some rehearsal, which was indispensable, as I said, and that was primarily with the training. And then like on the weekends we had a 5-day week. So on the weekends, I would then do some smaller rehearsals, like with the teen women that were going to be in that social services scene, or with Isaiah, the young man that she meets down the lane that brings her to the 4-H, to the bunny. The bunny.
Who was also in Winter's Bone. You've
Yes.
worked with a few actors across.
Yeah, I love to do that if I can, and especially because you feel very indebted to when actors stick a project out. If there's any way, crew too. I love, and if there's any way to work again with people that you've thrived with, it's such a undeniable pleasure.
Great. I think I'm getting an indication from Thomas that it's time to open up for questions. So, thank you. And
yes. Yeah, so I think the breaking down the novel, if the novel's pretty disposed to, like if you've already been able to see the film in your head, the novels, I think, is frequently, my limited experience is that, it's pretty easy to break down. And I start with a very literal sort of translation of just sort of putting the novel in screenplay form. And as I'm doing that, I'm realizing what I want to delete, what I can't either resonate with or wouldn't be interesting as film, right? And of course that's exposition and backstory, and that becomes the head knocker, right? Okay, if you're going to delete the character or a character being able to explicitly tell you these things, how will you do it? How will you pepper it in small ways? So that's to me that's the big part of novel to screenplay, is handling context and exposition. Obviously in a novel that's somehow respecting the unity of time, that's a caper, a heist, something that's happening in 24 hours or 48 hours, or a road trip that's all in the here and now. You don't have to worry about time and back. So, on one level, I have to pick very carefully, like an epic longitudinal novel would not be something that I could easily imagine working into the low-budget sort of social realist way that I work. Unless there were some big innovations, like just deciding to, use intertitles to leap, really concretely, I admire that when some films that have to cover a lot of years just go right to that chapter. They don't, it's a bold cut. A huge amount is left out by necessity. But so I kind of only know how to do adaptations of these smaller stories in which the span of time is not too great. But there's no harm in just chucking as much that you love. I kind of circle everything I love in the novel, and that goes right in. Every dialogue piece that I've liked goes in. The dialogue that's too wordy, I often delete. I had a funny story about that with Winter's Bone, which was John Hawkes, who plays the uncle Teardrop, the lead character's uncle. There had been some really windy monologues in the book. This guy went on, because he was also sort of the story, the family I want to say, the person that could tell this young girl sort of the history of the family. And at first I thought, okay, we'll try some of them. And then in the end, I started deleting all of them. And because I realized I can't follow a monologue. Monologues are for theater. Most people can't follow a monologue. A speech, someone giving a speech or a sermon, you can mostly follow because we're tuned into the idea that, but just a monologue of in a conversation is really hard for me. I deleted those, and John got his script, and he's like, where are those monologues? And he's like, I worked on those, and he had done that from the book. And I said, I found them really hard to like ingest, and he's like, oh, they mean a lot to me. So I knew I had to let him try them, and I knew that they'd come out in editing, but for me and John, it was important to, he was being so explicit, he was being so absolutely upfront. He wanted to do those, and so I absolutely, what good will it serve me to override his wishes? It's just not going to work in terms of rapport, and he's going to feel immediately that I squelch his initiative or his something that he feels is an imperative, and so that's an example of, the words were great, the novelist was super talented, they're in an interesting dialect. What's not to like? They just didn't serve the film form for me. I think, like many directors, I've been trained a certain way on the sort of protocol of set and whatnot, and one thing that was instilled in me, which I really, which I kept to, and was the idea that it's a little bit like what we're talking about with this reference I gave. It's very important to listen to the actor and to allow the actor to do quite a few takes frequently unto his or her what they're feeling, what they think is right first out of the gate, and then from there build on some adjustments. And if it's really not working at all, it's still an acknowledgement. They showed what they thought was working, or and still it's possible to go in a different direction. And one has to own that and just say, like, I'd like to go in a different direction, or I'd like to try something different, or not even using a lot of words. Just, it depends, how much you have to walk on eggshells versus how direct and honest and bold you can be. With someone like Tom, I could be so honest. I could just, and I could give mid-take directions. I could say, anytime I wanted with Tom, I could say, steal a look at Ben, check what he's doing, and she could just do it. That's not the case for the more experienced actor. They don't respond well to, some don't respond well to that. So it was really hard to adjust to such a different way, because I was really, I flourish when I feel like I can make some adjustments right then when I'm feeling them. But I would say that it's, I think it would have been helpful for me if I had, just in a really frank way, had more of a discussion about that with Ben at the beginning. And he probably would appreciate it too. And somehow we talked so much about content and whatnot and themes, but we just didn't get that part sorted well. And, it would have been, I think, probably, I don't know if we would have come to a better understanding or not, but the fact is, certainly worth trying, And then with working with non-professionals, people who were really doing those, who maybe are drawing really from life experience, it can be dicey, because then the anxiety of being in the filming setting can really alter what you saw in the improv or in the rehearsal, or what you saw when they were really doing their work. I remember touring the Veterans Administration Hospital on behalf of scouting for this film, and the day we scouted, there was that table that was set up in the lobby where this older vet, Vietnam era, was giving out these. He offered socks, and he offered all these other kind of swag from the VA, sort of basically suicide prevention swag, kind of an odd oxymoron on some level. But and he was so frank about veteran suicide, and he was so salt of the earth about the things that were on the table. And so I just thought, oh gosh, the way it's written in the script is that Tom waits patiently, and it shows her looking around, but I didn't know he was going to be there. That wasn't until the scout. So I asked, could you be there the day we shoot? But the risk is that he would be very, very awkward. And in some ways he was. There's not a lot of coverage of him.
No, you see him a bit from the back.
He's a silhouette, right? A profile of them talking. And he did well interacting with her. But then the second or third time, he started to get like a little stiffer, and it was hard. It became harder for him. So luckily we had the master, where he did really well. And then I knew for the coverage, I could use Tom. Tom, no matter what, she could keep asking. She would genuinely ask, what is this? And then off screen, he could always answer. If the camera wasn't on him, he could answer extremely sincerely. That's a gun lock. You put it in the barrel of a gun. Blah blah blah. Or that's the coin. If you think someone's in trouble, call this suicide line. So yeah, he was able to do just what he can do. So the trauma for the production and for me and where I would have felt so sad and disappointed, and was that if I had asked him to do a whole lot more, if I had written a bunch of lines for him, it wouldn't have happened. It couldn't have happened. So it's basically, you can't be too greedy, right? It's like people can do what they can do, and you have to really try to keep it right there. The beekeeper was a different story. She was extremely comfortable. She had had performing experience prior in her life. She'd actually been on a children's television show. I did not know that when I met this kind of eccentric beekeeper. That had been like, eons before in her life, very long time ago. But so she was so the more that Tom was able, and again, that's relying a lot on an actress like Thomason, right? Tom's really able to ask those questions. Tom has sincere curiosity. Tom can listen patiently and be a very active listener. So it was really quite easy for Sue to be herself, be very sincere about what she wanted to impart about bees, really show Tom how to handle them, really handle them. So that's something where Sue could also forget the camera because she's got, bees on her hands. And so it's case by case. Right now I'm doing a documentary with someone who I love. I think he's very performative, and he's in that kind of cohort that I mentioned this the other night, when I was here, and it seems to be heavy on my mind. The French director called Laurent Contant, he did the Class, which you guys may know, and 35-hour week, and he has said, and I think it's so true, that in every group of 50 people, there's going to be one person in every group of 50. He's like saying planetary-wise, doesn't matter where you are on this globe, in every 50 people, there's at least one, probably a lot more, but at least one person who is a stellar, charismatic performer of some aspect of their life. And, I really do try very much to stay open to just bumping up against those folks when I can. And so this one man I'm referencing right now, I haven't really tried him on a rigorous narrative situation. I mean, I've seen him at work. I've seen him with his cat. I've seen him in his extreme bachelor existence. I've seen him try very hard to do something monumental for him, which is to migrate, to force himself to stop sleeping on the couch and to go into sleep in his bed. That's going to be a big deal for him. And he's able to talk about it in these really rich ways, but I don't know what it's like to actually ask him to perform in settings where they aren't part of his life. I know he'd do well in the work. He, by the way, have you seen Leave No Trace? Or? Not yet tonight. So you can look for him. He's the vet that diverts the pills.
Oh, yeah.
Just a common practice with these completely hideous, unappealing meds that were distributed to American service people by Big Pharma that no one wants to take after, because you... And so I'll give you an example. He had this great line, I can't write the lines of a street-savvy vet who's had 9 lives already and just salt-of-the-earth working-class guy that just knows no bullshit, and I mean, I'm a middle-class this is really who I am, It's like, there's not one point of congruency in terms of how I would write those lines for such a character. He could write those lines, obviously, or say them. And he had one line. I didn't get to use it in the end. He and I still reminisce, and if he were here, he could perform it very well. But, he was just trying to give an example of like how worthless one of the drugs was in terms of street value. And he's like, he's basically apologizing to Will, the father character. He's like, I can't do anything with that, unless you can find someone that wants to gain 70 pounds and drool all day, And it was just so vivid, and it was so right on, And he knew that you have extreme weight gain on this, I don't know if it's a tranquilizer, and he knew that, it leaves you sort of just at half-mast, sort of kind of good for nothing, and so he just, that rolled off his tongue, and so he's someone who I think he there's like, now when I read a story or think about something, there's no story in this world I don't want to put Derek in, But I don't know where, so it's something to discuss, and then for real, like trying to discover that, what am I going to do? Ask Derek to like, he does maintenance at a motel full time. I mean, at what point do you even take the risk to say, how is it even that I can approach someone like that and say like, oh, can you stop doing your 40-hour job and come explore these workshops with me, so I have to be kind of certain that he, because kind of certain that he's game, Well, so couple responses. So with the doc and narrative, I like to keep going in both. Like the Derek's in the documentary that we've been filming for a minute now, a couple years actually. So I want to be able to finish that, and I think So that's about life after incarceration. So Derek and the 4 men that he works with, not his main job, but sort of the job that they aspire to, that gives them a lot of pleasure and growth, post-incarceral growth, is that they run a gym. Because the one thing that you can get out of prison is you can come out very buff, very fit, and so we have a very bizarre situation where you have this nation of like post-incarcerated Adonis. It's another freaking weird thing about the country I live in, that we would have such a bizarre kind of confluence of things. But there are a lot of we don't. It's funny that we make films about lots and lots of zombies. I haven't seen one, but I've seen a lot of post-incarcerated, very happening people that need work. But of course, we don't want to make too many films about that. But the fact is, so that leads me to why I can't make. If I wanted to make films about zombies, I could. What you offered was, oh, you can just do about anything right now. And if the post-incarceral men committed a lot of violence or recidivated, I could probably do well there if they had firearms. I mean, Derek's thrown his gun in the Hudson. I mean, the major river that runs through New York. His gun's not in his life. It's not in any of these men's life. They'd be violated in a second. Many of them are men of color. Derek's white. So if I wanted to add violence, if I wanted to show, if I wanted to show how bad they were, that would be worthwhile. If I could sort of do, just strap on Animal Kingdom, for example. I'm just saying that Animal Kingdom I cite because that film, to me, though it's Australian, has a lot of the ingredients that make an American film very commercially viable. And I'm trying to do the part after they don't have guns and they're not criminals anymore. It's very hard to become a non-criminal. It's very, very hard. But I'm trying, and that's, they talk about suspense, and I find it suspenseful every day. But it's an internal suspense. It's like, do you like yourself? Do you have self-esteem? Are you a pariah? Do people not want to deal with you? Can you make your rent? You could make your rent by going down the street because you know how to make your rent in about an hour. And you're not. That's suspense, but how do you show that? You could get your kid a whole bunch of birthday presents because you know how to go out and get money. You're a hustler. And you're putting on your own handcuffs and say, I will not go out there because the second I go out there, most likely I'll get jammed up. So I'm in a predicament where I like to take topics from real life and yet because I want to not tart it up, I don't want to add those ingredients that make it so commercially appealing, I am in a low budget range. The conundrum is, how can more of us in this room, anyone here who also is interested in, I almost think, it could be this global dogma. I don't know if you guys remember when the Scandinavians were a little bit naughty with their Dogma 95, which I happen to love, but, a dogma that you can be, oxymoron again, a malleable dogma, but the dogma, the idea that a bunch of us around the world would vow to try to, for like the next 2 years, tell films without firearms. Shocking. Could we even do it? What would happen to the film industry? It would collapse. It's completely reliant and addicted to the possession and utilization of weaponry, And it's like, I love this, though he was sort of ultra-violent himself, Sam Fuller, an old codger American director, he used to say, what we fear more, metal bullets, dime a dozen. They come out of a gun, as we all know, if it's an automatic, in flurries. They're meaningless, and the bullet of emotion is what we're so scared of. Because you can't solve, when the bullet of emotion hits, it ramifies for days, for years, right? You're preoccupied, you're concerned, you worry, you love, you're betrayed. Those things don't heal so easily. Either a bullet kills you or maims you, but you don't have a whole lot to reflect on, do you? It hasn't utilized your mind. It's really just mutilated your body. And so I'm between a rock and a hard bullet because I'm trying to go against the grain myself. But it's, and I'm not trying to have a, pity thing here. I'm just trying to say it's super hard. And it's similarly, if you don't want women to undress in films, or undress in as much as the man undresses. I'm into we've all got bodies, seen one, seen them all, but meaning that they should be sort of equally, if we're going to be doing that it shouldn't be the burden on female actors to undress more frequently. Why? And that's where I think that's where Time's Up enters. So maybe we have to conclude our whole, the double entendre of Time's Up on our talk and Time's Up on some of these older things that we've been doing for a lot of years now, and so I think, I'm in that school of filmmakers, and there are probably a lot out here where, there's 2 boxes to tick. One is hard road to hoe, and, do what's commonly popular. And I clearly, for better or worse, ticked that first box, and here I am.
Thank you so much, Debra.
Yeah. Thank you. Very good discussion.